Global events often feel like this. Just this swirling maelstrom, don't they?
Absolutely.
News cycles just bombard us, and I think a lot of us feel overwhelmed, like we're constantly trying to catch up, but never really grasping the deeper currents.
Yeah, the signal-to-noise ratio can be pretty bad sometimes.
Exactly. Well, today, we're going to try and cut through some of that noise. We're taking a deep dive into the insights of a truly unique and often provocative military mind, Colonel Douglas Macgregor.
Ah, Macgregor. Definitely someone with strong views.
Right. And our mission here is to unpack his, let's say, blunt assessments from a recent interview. We want to offer you a kind of shortcut to understanding the complex geopolitical landscape that's shaping our world right now. Pull out those crucial, maybe counterintuitive insights that you might not get from the usual headlines. So for those who might not know him well, Colonel Macgregor, he's known as a brilliant strategist. I mean, he famously masterminded the rout of the Iraqi Republican Guard at the Battle of 73 Easting during Desert Storm.
A textbook maneuver, really.
Incredible feat, and achieved, remarkably, without a single U.S. casualty. Academically, he's got a BS in engineering, an MA in comparative politics, and a PhD in international relations. Written several books, too, especially on U.S. military reform.
So he comes with credentials, both practical and academic.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But he's certainly known for his uncompromising, often controversial views, particularly his critiques of what he calls globalist foreign policy. He can be like sand in the eye for some people.
Well, and I think that's what makes his perspective important for you listening to hear. He offers a fundamentally different lens, doesn't he?
He really does.
He challenges those mainstream narratives, pushes us to critically examine what's really going on behind the scenes. It forces you to ask, what basic assumptions are actually driving global policy today? And are they even accurate?
That's the core question, isn't it? So with that context, let's dive into the Middle East. He sees it as a tinderbox. Let's unpack his central critique of current U.S. policy, especially regarding Iran. He basically argues Washington's policymaking is driven by this dangerous mix: arrogance, self-delusion.
Okay.
And he points to significant influence from what he calls the Israel lobby and the military-industrial complex. He says, quote, "A great deal of money is involved in pushing this war."
Right, the follow the money aspect.
Exactly. And militarily, he really questions the core assumption that air and naval power alone can force, unconditional surrender from a country like Iran.
Which is huge and mountainous.
Huge.
Yeah.
He points out it's 79 times the size of Israel. He predicts any air campaign would do, quote, "a lot of damage, sure, but likely lead to only limited effect and ultimately a long war."
So not a quick fix by any means, in his view.
Not at all. Now, this next claim he makes really goes against the grain.
Okay.
The nuclear narrative about Iran. He dismisses claims that Iran is close to getting nuclear weapons as, quote, propaganda.
Wow, okay, that's a strong word.
Very strong. He says the intelligence, and he mentions figures like Tulsi Gabbard being aware of this intelligence, indicates Iran do not have and are not near the formulation of a nuclear weapon. He even points out, a bit wryly perhaps, that our friend Netanyahu has been telling us for the last 25 years that Israel is within a year or 2 months or 2 weeks of a nuclear weapon, so this is nothing new.
So he sees it as a recurring justification.
That seems to be his take, yeah. And he then describes the U.S. presidency, Senate, and House as largely, quote, obedient to Israeli desires. And he attributes that to enormous amounts of money poured into the re-election campaigns.
Right. So he's connecting domestic U.S. politics directly to foreign policy choices in the Middle East.
Directly.
And it's really vital then to grasp how Macgregor translates these policy decisions as he sees them into real-world consequences for the global economy.
Yes.
He warns that, in his assessment, the entire world is lining up against Israel and the United States. That's a pretty stark warning.
It really is.
And economically, he highlights significant dangers. He predicts oil prices surging potentially to $7 a gallon for gasoline. And he notes it's already over $75 a barrel now.
Which is already high.
Exactly. And that, he argues, would disrupt supply chains, make goods more expensive for, working families.
The ripple effect.
Definitely. He also challenges this idea that the U.S. can just engage in bombing with impunity. He asserts the U.S. doesn't have the air defense capability to defend all its bases across the region: Persian Gulf, Iraq, Syria, Jordan.
That's a big claim about vulnerability.
It is. He says surface ships are not invulnerable or invincible either. And he mentions reports, and we should stress these are reports he's citing, of F-35s being shot down over Iran, maybe even a pilot captured. He suggests we're going to see more of that.
That's quite an assertion.
It is. And another provocative point he raises, which is, certainly something to think about, is the potential for terrorist action inside our country.
The internal security angle.
Yeah. He cites an estimate of 31 million people illegally in the United States, many arriving in the last few years, and claims large numbers of them. Very dangerous criminals, and in many cases, terrorists. That's his assessment.
That's a very specific and serious claim he's making there.
It is. And related to the regional conflict, McGregor paints an increasingly dire picture for Israel, too. He says their Iron Dome is a sieve, implying it's not as effective as claimed, and that they're running out of munitions.
That sounds precarious.
Extremely. And this leads him to raise a highly dangerous possibility. That Israel might threaten to use nuclear weapons if they feel cornered, if they're, quote, held hostage to Israeli use of the weapon. He sees that leading to a truly catastrophic regional outcome.
Ultimate nightmare scenario.
Exactly. So bringing it all together, McGregor asserts the actual goal regarding Iran, in his view, isn't about non-existent nukes. It's to destroy Iran as a large nation state, to weaken it, and then to replace its government.
Driven by what, according to him?
Driven, he says, by financial interests wanting control over Iran's enormous resources of oil and natural gas.
So resources over security concerns in his analysis.
That's his argument, yes.
Okay, let's pivot then. Another major global flashpoint. Ukraine. Colonel McGregor offered a very distinct perspective there, too. What does his analysis mean for you trying to understand that war?
Well, first off, he directly counters the narrative that Russia wants to invade Western Europe.
Right, that common fear.
He says Russia's initial motivations were about protecting Russian-speaking citizens in Ukraine, who he claims were being treated very badly as second-class citizens, and in fact, in many cases, they were simply being killed, murdered.
Strong language again.
Very. He argues Putin initially tried to use the Minsk Accords. Those agreements meant to settle the Donbas conflict, to keep Ukraine whole, but ensure respect for Russian speakers.
Right.
But McGregor claims Putin discovered the accords were a fraud, just designed to buy time for the Ukrainians to build up their military capability.
So a betrayal in that view.
That's how he frames it. And he claims the West, especially the U.S. and allies, wanted to turn Ukraine into a military battering ram to, quote, destroy the Russian state and carve it up.
Why? What's the motive there, according to him?
He puts it down to ideology. He says, the existence of a Russian Orthodox Christian country with its unique ethnicity, language, culture, religion was, quote, anathema to the people that are globalists.
Wow. Okay, so that's his framing of the underlying objectives.
Yes, and that leads to the question of how the military situation evolved, right? Given those objectives as he sees them.
Right. How did the fighting actually play out?
Well, he describes Russia's initial moves into eastern Ukraine as not with guns blazing. He says they hoped for negotiations.
Okay.
But they found the Ukrainian military far more potent than he anticipated and realized the West had no interest whatsoever into coming to any sort of arrangement that respected Russia's legitimate security interests.
So the gloves came off then?
Essentially. Russia then adopted what he calls a strategic defense, building up strong defensive lines. And then, he claims, the Ukrainians, on bad advice given by the US-UK senior military leaders, began launching pointless attack after pointless attack into the teeth of these defenses.
A meat grinder strategy, basically.
That's the implication. And his casualty figures are, well, they're stark. He asserts Ukrainians have lost at least 1.5 million dead on the battlefield.
1.5 million. That's vastly higher than most public estimates. Where does he get that?
He says it's compiled from looking at graveyards that are filled to capacity and new ones that are being opened, plus hospital data, obituaries. It's a methodology based on observation, he claims.
Okay. And Russian losses?
He estimates those much lower, between 110 and 120,000 dead, noting they have a very good system of evacuating wounded. And controversially, he claims Russia now possesses probably the most professional and capable ground force in the world.
That's quite a statement, given the initial setbacks widely reported.
It is. He attributes the war's continuation largely to Western actions. We keep shoveling cash and now increasing these medium and long-range strike weapons.
Prolonging the inevitable, in his view.
That seems to be it. He also points a finger at corruption, estimating a third or more of all the cash and maybe the same amount of military equipment sent to Ukraine end up sold on the black market, benefiting Ukrainian officers, in his opinion.
So where does he see it ending?
Militarily, he believes the war is effectively over. He predicts Russia will eventually take everything east of the Dnieper River, that major river dividing Ukraine, plus the key port of Odessa.
Why Odessa specifically?
To eliminate Ukraine's vital sea outlet, cutting off a route for weapons imports, he argues. He even suggests they might eventually move straight into Kiev to destroy this regime, despite, he notes, Russia's historical reluctance to damage the city.
A complete redrawing of the map, essentially.
That's what he predicts. And his assessment of NATO, it's blunt. He says NATO couldn't fight its way out of a wet paper bag. Yeah. Undermanned and under-equipped. Unprepared for what he calls industrial process warfare that sustained high-volume production of munitions.
Which Russia has apparently geared up for.
According to him, yes. And he reiterates his view. Russians aren't interested in ruling hostile Western Ukrainians, just preventing that territory from being used as a platform to project power against Russia.
Okay. This next point offers a really interesting, maybe counterintuitive perspective from Colonel McGregor. He pivots to the broader global chess game.
Right, connecting the dots.
He posits that the banks in London, the banks in New York City, the financial interests were very frustrated. They thought Putin could be removed, and then they could move in, strip Russia of its natural resources, and abuse its people as they saw fit. That's his framing.
A very critical view of Western financial motives.
Extremely. Having failed there, he claims, they've now turned their attentions to the Middle East with a similar agenda for Iran. Same playbook, different target.
An overarching economic driver for conflict in his analysis.
Seems so. Then he brings in China. He discusses the One Belt, One Road initiative, that vast infrastructure project, calling it a highway for commerce.
Okay.
He argues the U.S., even though it's not a Eurasian land power, could benefit by improving its own infrastructure. But instead, he says, the U.S. has turned instead to destruction as our asset, trying to destroy what the Chinese have been financing and building.
A destructive versus constructive approach.
Right. And he thinks that destructive approach is not going to work either.
Right.
Which then raises this really interesting question. What future alliances does he see emerging from all this?
Yeah, what's the end game look like?
He suggests the possibility of a Eurasian economic bloc, specifically mentioning Berlin, Paris, Rome, and Moscow.
Wow, linking major European capitals with Moscow.
Yeah. Recognizing that historically, he argues, Berlin and Moscow have every reason to cooperate, and that the two world wars were actually anomalies disrupting that natural partnership.
That's a very revisionist take on 20th century European history, arguing the conflicts were the exception, not the rule in terms of long-term interests.
It definitely challenges conventional thinking.
So he's basically saying, from his viewpoint, the natural economic gravity for Europe, especially Germany, pulls eastward towards Russia, resources, geography. The wars messed that up, he thinks.
Okay.
But McGregor doesn't just diagnose problems, does he? He offers solutions. Radical ones, perhaps, and he admits Washington probably won't listen.
Right. He outlined a plan recently, didn't he? In an article.
He did, a 5-step plan, starting, interestingly, with the UN.
Okay, what are the steps?
First, request UN Security Council support for a ceasefire, presumably in the Middle East context he was discussing.
Step 1.
Ceasefire.
Step 2. Immediately halts all aid to Israel until they stop murdering people in Gaza, and for that matter, increasingly in the West Bank, and they've already done a lot of that in southern Lebanon. Pretty strong conditions there.
Very direct. Okay, what's 3? Third, bring in troops from non-aligned countries that could come in and secure Gaza. Peacekeepers, essentially, but from nations without a direct stake.
Non-aligned forces.
Fourth, convene a great power conference, U.S., Russia, China, India, and Brazil.
Interesting group. Who's not there?
Notably, Great Britain. He specifically excludes them, saying Britain is not a great power anymore and would just sabotage it. But he includes India and Brazil for population, economy, and representing Latin America.
So a new concert of powers, basically. And the final step.
Step 5 is fundamental. The U.S. must recognize the limits of our power as well as the limits of our interests.
A call for realism.
Exactly. He argues that pursuing military hegemony on a global scale is bankrupting. He draws a parallel to Britain leaving India when its debt-to-GDP ratio was 240%.
Implying the U.S. is on a similar unsustainable path.
That's the clear implication. He then asserts that Washington currently doesn't care what America thinks or what Americans want. They believe, quote, "We control the media, we control finance, we can dictate to them what their interests are."
A pretty cynical take on DC's relationship with the public.
Very. And this leads to his ultimate concern, what he calls his greatest fear,
Which is?
that if Israel realizes it's reached a dead end strategically, they will threaten the use of a nuclear weapon.
We touched on that earlier.
Right. And he adds, if they use one, someone else, somewhere, will provide a nuclear weapon for use against them, and that'll be the end of it. Just catastrophic escalation.
What a sobering thought to end on. That was quite a deep dive. A truly blunt, sometimes unsettling perspective on the forces at play.
Definitely unsettling.
Colonel McGregor leaves us with a lot to chew on, doesn't he? Always reminding us, as he often does, to follow the money when trying to understand these big global decisions. Because, as he puts it, if the money runs out, then the whole thing comes apart.
And I think this kind of analysis, McGregor's analysis, it really encourages you, the listener, to question those base assumptions, to look beyond the surface narrative and consider the underlying economic, strategic motivations that might be driving world events. It really highlights how knowledge isn't just about knowing facts, but understanding context, applying critical thinking, especially in this age of information overload.
Well said. We really hope this deep dive into Colonel McGregor's insights, pulled from his recent interview, has given you a clearer, maybe a more challenging, but ultimately more informed view of the current geopolitical landscape.
Hopefully some food for thought.
Definitely. And if you found this deep dive valuable, please do take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Geopolitics Gazette YouTube channel. We'll keep bringing you more essential analysis like this.
Your support helps us keep doing these deep dives.
It really does. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.